Generally, when people think of visual novels, they think of route-based ones with multiple love interests. However, there are a good amount of linear stories that specifically star single heroine visual novels that can have real value, but are generally not talked about as much as route-based ones. In this video, I want to cover and analyze different types of one heroine focused visual novels, as well as the pros and cons of reading these over multi-heroine ones. When I think of a developer that is the closest to the face of making one heroine focused visual novels, it's actually surprisingly Key. Despite the fact that they are most known for some of the most popular route-based Nakige visual novels like Clannad, Little Busters, and Rewrite, they also have a good number of one heroine focused ones, including Planetarian, Tomoyo After, Harmonia, Lunaria, Virtualized Moonchild, and Stella of the End. Using these examples, I think this is a great opportunity to show what I mean by one heroine for the purposes of this video. It's possible to have a visual novel with multiple girls, but still only one heroine. In this case, I believe heroine means a girl who's going to actually be romanced, or at the very least, gets a large amount of screen time and development. A good example to start off with is Lunaria. Even though the main character, T-Bit, has a female rival in Mumioth in the esports VR racing game Sky Out Forever, I don't think anyone would consider her a real heroine when the clear focus of the game is T-Bit's relationship with a companion AI, Lunar Q. Staying on topic with Key, I think a particularly good contrast of one heroine VNs versus multi-heroine VNs is Planetarian and Clannad. They were released by Key in the same year, but not only do they have completely different writers, they also have very different lengths and goals. While Clannad wanted to be a huge 50+ hour visual novel with a ton of routes and an unlockable afterstory, Planetarian was more willing to experiment. It has a unique dystopian setting starring a robot girl and an unnamed junker, but still finds a way to have an emotional ending in a 5-hour runtime. If I had to be honest, Planetarian didn't really hit me emotionally, but I know it definitely did for many others. And I think a big part of that is that the story only focuses on 2 characters, so the story can just work on making you care about the buildup and climax of their relationship. By the time you reach the ending, many people have become attached enough to feel something when the inevitable Key-style tragedy happens. Going into another literal one heroine only visual novel is a relatively recent release, Nandomeka no Hajimemashite, developed by Purplesoft, though the official localization by Sekai Project calls it Nice to Meet You Again. There's exactly one heroine, Sui Chomai. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to count the main character's mom as a heroine, even though she eventually becomes important, and Laplace is only debatably a girl. Anyway, Nice to Meet You Again purely focuses on Sui as the only love interest. Hell, the only female character who's actually the main character's age, with a sprite and any actual screen time. I think at least for this story, keeping Sui as the only main female helps excellently ground everything and makes it feel much more focused. Time travel stories are already pretty rare in VNs, and since they tend to have routes, the writers often have to decide whether to focus more on the typical harem rom-com stuff or actually develop the world building around the time travel. Since Sui is the only main heroine, Nice to Meet You Again does not have to worry about finding that balance. Instead, it not only presents Sui as a very likable, mature heroine, but also ties her naturally into the time travel aspect. More specifically, when the main character, Yumeto, time travels from being a 30-year-old salaryman back into his high school days for about a week, into supposedly the happiest point of his life, he and Sui clearly already have a lot of mutual affection and are close to, but not quite going out yet. I'll have to stop myself from spoiling the rest of this visual novel, but let's just say, because Sui is the sole heroine, there are a lot of interesting twists and reveals about why Yumeto could not remember Sui while he was 30 years old, and, more importantly, surprisingly great emotional investment in the relationship and how they mutually affect each other as the story goes on. This visual novel alone, at least to me, is a great argument for why one heroine only visual novels, when done right, can work really well. In particular, I think it's a great contrast to another time travel focused visual novel developed by Purple Software, Chrono Clock. Chrono Clock is a typical route-based moege with some attempted emotional character-focused moments and an interesting time travel gimmick, but because the writer has to decide whether to focus on rom-com stuff or the time travel stuff and can't really commit to either, it ends up becoming a weird, forgettable, half-assed story instead. Unless you really need a route-based structure to enjoy a visual novel, if you're looking for a good modern time travel VN, I heavily recommend Nice to Meet You Again, at the very least, very heavily over Chrono Clock. To be a little bit more negative about literal one heroine only stories, let's go into another relatively recent release, Kanade, developed by Frontwing. This is a linear, short, all-ages visual novel, roughly 5 hours long, that's supposed to be a pure love story about a love song that will save the world. And they definitely will mention this goal many times throughout the visual novel. Now, I can understand why people would like this game. Kanade herself is a decently likable, wholesome dere girl. However, even as someone who likes dere heroines, I thought Kanade was the ultimate example of a half-assed visual novel. You have this really interesting concept where the main character and the main heroine originally met through being pen pals. You have the heroine being a half-alien with some interesting powers. And, most importantly, you have a post-apocalyptic world where the Earth has been taken over by plants and people are just trying to get by despite the possibility of the world ending. So what happens when you try to mix a cute but shallow romance with a post-apocalyptic setting and a relatively lighthearted short read? In my opinion, something incredibly forgettable at best. I believe the intention was for Frontwing to make a visual novel that could serve as a starter romance VN for newcomers, and to some degree, I can see that. The visuals, presentation, and audio are pretty good, and the VN feels like it's trying to be something like one of the entries from the Makoto Shinkai Disaster Anime Movie Trilogy, aka Your Name, Weathering with You, and Suzume. Unfortunately, I think even those Makoto Shinkai movies have more going on in 2 hours each than Kanade did in 5. While Kanade technically has interesting twists and potentially interesting side characters, there just isn't enough time to properly develop any of them, especially since the VN is heavily dedicated to being lighthearted, with only very mild melodrama that gets resolved quickly in order to fit in more cute romantic scenes between Yuto and Kanade. In my opinion, there are much better starter romance visual novels that can be read all ages on Steam and still have actual character depth. If you're not allergic to Yuri visual novels, I think Lilia and Natsuka Painting Lies, also developed by Frontwing, and also written by the same scenario writer as Kanade, is a much better all-ages linear VN. Now, let's move on to another interesting but somewhat rare case for one heroine-focused VNs, Fandiscs. Fandiscs generally are not one heroine-focused for the most part. They're either after stories for route-based visual novels covering all the heroines, or they add new routes for heroines that people wanted routes for but weren't in the original. That said, we do occasionally get fandiscs that focus on one heroine specifically. I think the best examples of these are Aokana's Extra 1 and Extra 2, which focuses on Mashiro and Misaki respectively. What's fitting about these two fandiscs is that they properly take the tones of their original VN routes and in a way refine them. Mashiro's original Aokana route was the most romance-focused one, so in Extra 1, her after-story fandisc is 100% pure wholesome romance. They don't even bother to include flying circus scenes. So if you're someone who just really liked the romantic development and Mashiro's super moe personality, you get that in spades in Extra 1. On the other end of the spectrum is Misaki's routes. Her original Aokana route focused the most on the mechanics of flying circus, how you can subvert said mechanics, along with the most character-focused drama. In her fandisc Extra 2, which is a full-on 10-hour sequel, it continues said flying circus character-focused drama from her original route. Many people consider Extra 2 outright better than her original route, giving Misaki and even other characters more character development. This begs the question though, why would Sprite go for this method instead of just making a traditional route-based fandisc? I think it specifically works since Sprite loves to go all out on their graphics, especially CGs, giving the heroines in these fandiscs the best possible look and the most concentrated tone possible. For those who love Extra 1 and Extra 2, they definitely cannot complain with how those turned out. However, there's an unfortunate aspect to consider when going for only two separate one heroine focused fandiscs. There are so many heroines that people were begging to get routes, and by not making a typical route-based fandisc, those people are left hanging. Especially since Sprite basically low-key cancelled Aokana If01 for Minamo, and long before that, Aokana Zwei, which would have been a full-on sequel with routes for Saki and a brand new character. Another interesting one heroine-focused fandisc is If My Hearted Wings Snow Presence. This was an unusual release, since If My Hearted Wings Flight Diary was released before Snow Presence and was a more traditional route-based fandisc. which also included a Kotori afterstory, which makes Snow Presence that much of a weirder release. Another reason this fandisc is especially unusual is that Poltop was apparently experimenting with anime-looking 3D graphics instead of traditional sprites. They also tried to go for some kind of binaural audio, so the position Kotori appeared on screen affected how the audio came through your headphones or speakers. Personally, I thought Snow Presence was just fine. Since the visual novel is only a few hours long and is mostly just slice of life scenes during winter time with no major character development, I'd only recommend reading Snow Presence if you really liked Kotori Habane. The main good thing that came out of Snow Presence release is that, in my opinion, it helped normalize Poltop making fandisc trilogies, which eventually led them to make A Sky Full of Stars Interstellar Focus, easily my favorite visual novel fandisc to date, but that fandisc is not One Heroine focused, so I sadly cannot talk more about it in this video. The final fandisc I'm going to talk about is Mashiro Ito Symphony HD Sana Edition. The circumstances for this title are so unique that I need to give a very quick history lesson to make my point. First of all, the original Mashiro Ito Symphony was released in the late 2000s. It did not have a Sana route, but Sana still ended up becoming the most popular heroine, especially after the development she got in Miyu's route. A few years later, it became common for Japanese visual novels to get console ports with brand new heroine routes. In this case, Mashifone got a PSP port with new routes for Sana and a new girl named Yutsuki, who never came back for some reason. In the 2020s, Palette made an HD remaster of Mashiro Ito Symphony. Unfortunately, this version did not include Sana's route, since it focused on making the best looking version of the original 4 routes. But considering that Sana is the most popular heroine, they'd be stupid to not include her route in some way. So, alongside an HD remaster of the original VN, they made a separate release called Mashiro Ito Symphony HD Sana Edition, which ends up classifying it as a one heroine focused visual novel. Not only does it bring in the route content from the PSP version fully remastered, but Sana is the only heroine to get brand new art and CGs, most notably for brand new H scenes. Since console ports do not have 18+ content, this makes it so Sana got the best treatment by far compared to the original 4 heroines, since she gets H scenes in Palette's newer art style, alongside I believe newer scenes in addition to her fairly long PSP port route. Now personally, even after her development, I was not big on Sana, but I could definitely see why people like her. Considering how much people loved Sana Edition, even over the original Mashiro Ito Symphony, this is definitely a case where cashing in on the most popular heroine was the right call for both fans and the developers. However, if you're like me and Sana did not impress you in the original Mashifone, this does make this a separate release, which, might I add, costs almost the same as the original VN that had 4 routes, likely not worth purchasing. Now we're going to get into one of the more interesting, but also honestly, more frustrating types of one heroine focused releases. Ones that could have been full route based VNs, but instead get split into separate one heroine focused entries, or what I like to call One Heroine Trilogies Divided. If you want to read all the routes for these series, you end up paying more overall, so the consumer doesn't get as much bang for their buck. However, you could also argue that if you're one of those people who doesn't always read every route in a visual novel, you could theoretically just buy 1 or 2 entries of this type of trilogy and not have to feel wasteful about paying for a traditional route-based VN but then not end up reading all the routes. My personal favorite example of this type is the Destiny Star Girlfriend trilogy. It's a comedy-focused moege series with a magical girl theme, and the 3 main heroines all have very unique personalities that feel very much in line with the Minato Soft style, very goofy but with surprisingly decent character development, especially considering they star in single heroine VNs that are only a little under 10 hours each. What I like about this series is that I've seen people who have read all 3 entries like I have, but I've also seen people who have only read 1 or 2 and still have a good time, because despite the magical girl theme, they don't have all the same developments, and they don't overly info dump you with magical girl lore. Instead, they get right into the romance and the jokes and the unique development for each heroine. Honestly, the only issue I have with the Destiny Star Girlfriend series, besides the fact that I technically had to pay more to read all the routes compared to a pre-packaged 3-route moege, is the fact that the Fujiko Fandisc is not only untranslated, it's also pretty easily the worst entry in the series, since it had no character development and was basically just a Nukige. Speaking of which, I can also think of 3 different Moe Nukige trilogies that use this one heroine focused separated trilogy format. These include the Seiki or Special Place series, the Uchi no X or Uchikano series, and the Succubus Sessions trilogy. Unlike the Destiny Star Girlfriend trilogy, I don't really have much to say about describing these titles. They are clearly made to be less expensive, shorter VNs with a clear focus on H scenes and minimal to no plot or character development. That said, there is an issue specifically with the Succubus Sessions series, a potential worry for any episodic style release. The fact that only one entry, the one about Mami Mamiya, was translated by Shirobune, but apparently they weren't able to get the rights to translate the next 2 games. Now, I know most people probably don't care about this Succubus Sessions trilogy. It's kind of a weird guilty pleasure of mine, since I usually don't care about Nukige, but the fact that they actually attempted to make a kind of serious backdrop with the hidden Succubus village was amusing to me. So finding out that years later, Shirobune was not able to continue the rest of the series was disappointing. And though the series probably isn't anything special, it just goes to show that episodic releases can work if everything is released and available. But if the series doesn't finish, whether in translation form or in the original language, then therein lies the problem with One Heroine Trilogies divided into separate releases. You could get an incomplete experience due to unforeseen circumstances. Another weird issue is about 2 of the trilogies I mentioned. For both the Special Place and the Uchikano series, there's the fact that the third entries of both do not just focus on 1, but 2 heroines. And while it's not translated, the second entry of the Succubus Session series also stars 2 heroines. First off, if the series is going to have 4 heroines, why make it a trilogy? Why not just make it a quadrology? And at that point, if every entry is only going to be a few hours at most, why not make it a whole 10 to 15 hour Nukige like many of the others out there? I don't get it. Like I said a few times already, episodic releases are clearly just a way for developers to try to get as much money as possible. But I'm pretty sure part of the reason why many people, myself included, love visual novels so much is because most stories are complete in one package. Even in Nukige, which are meant to be H-scene focused. While I have praised single heroine visual novels as long as they can get a decent amount of screen time and a decent story in them, with shallow, short Nukige series like these, I just don't see the point of separating them. But now, let's get into a more interesting topic, one that takes a more literal reading of this video's title, visual novels that are pseudo one heroine stories. These are VNs that focus on one heroine, but technically still have multiple girls who play important roles in the story. When I think of pseudo one heroine stories, the standout examples are the individual episodic entries in the 9-9 and the Criminal Borders series. While they're by different companies, Palette and Purple Software respectively, they're both written by scenario writer Kazuki Fumi. What I find interesting about these 2 series specifically is that while they each have 4 main heroines, the episodic release structure means each episode technically focuses on one heroine at a time, even though the series as a whole has 4 main heroines total. Leaving aside the fact that episodic releases can be controversial because people don't like paying for full stories and separate purchases, what are the actual advantages and disadvantages of having 4 heroines in a linear story, but dividing the releases so each one focuses on a single heroine? From my perspective, and this might sound pessimistic, but similar to the complaints I have about One Heroine Trilogies divided, clearly one benefit is that it allows developers to get more money and focus more on one heroine at a time, especially with romance and H scenes. With 9-9 specifically, since the series technically uses an alternate universe format for each episode, even though it still continues the plot in a way that lets the reader know certain twists from previous entries, each episode is at least partly moege style. This basically allows the series a unique way to force a heroine route order while still technically advancing the plot and avoiding route locks in a traditional moege plot-ge hybrid. Naturally, the main disadvantage would mostly apply to people who only like to read the routes of their favorite heroine or heroines in a moege. The Criminal Border, or as it's called Liminal Border on Steam, is more interesting though, because unlike 9-9, it is not built on alternate universes. In fact, part of the appeal for some is that the main character Itsuki eventually hooks up with all 4 main heroines in some way in the same timeline. This aspect alone could arguably make this series not fit this video at all. Since the story is linear, the writer can still structure each episode so that the main character mostly focuses on one heroine at a time based on the current story arc. For the most part, I'd say this works. Sure, some things can feel forced or underdeveloped because the main character keeps switching between heroines to enforce this casual sex positivity thing, but at least the other heroines don't just get completely left behind when they're not the focus. That said, this linear story with casual sex and a fairly unique art style In my opinion, probably part of why the Criminal Border series isn't more widely loved in the VN community, even though it's a well-written and well-structured story on paper. Another interesting Psuedo One Heroine visual novel written by Kazuki Fumi is Kimagure Temptation, developed by Silkies Plus Wasabi. Based on the cover and the design of the main heroine, Annalise, you would think this is a one heroine nukige with a succubus heroine. In a sense, that's partially true. The vast majority of the time, the main character is talking to Annalise in a small apartment, and Annalise is the only heroine the main character, Haruhisa, can romance and have sex with. However, it turns out the apartment is filled with ghost girls that Haruhisa and Annalise have to interact with to solve a supernatural ghost mystery. And honestly, at least to me, you could make the argument that these characters are better developed than Annalise herself, with many of them having really interesting backstories, even the main antagonist. By contrast, Annalise isn't a bad character by any means, but she is a little shallow, since a lot of her dialogue is just flirting with the main character and occasionally letting him sleep with her if he makes the right choice. In fact, the only real depth Annalise gets doesn't even come until near the very end of the game, and while that twist is super interesting, it doesn't exactly make her much deeper moment to moment throughout the story before that twist. So ultimately, Kimagure Temptation is a visual novel that is still more or less one heroine focused, despite a decent amount of fleshed out side female characters. I think how much you like the VN depends on how much you like Annalise, since you'll be seeing her on screen the entire story. That said, I found Kimagure Temptation an interesting contrast to another Silkies Plus Wasabi visual novel written by Kazuki Fumi, Nanairo Reincarnation. Nanairo Reincarnation is also a ghost-related mystery story like Kimagure Temptation, but has 3 romanceable heroines and an extra 4 to 5 girls the main character can sleep with, mostly due to a silly semen demon magic contract concept. But there's very much an obvious true heroine in Kotori, to the point where she even kinda takes over routes that aren't hers. Even though I personally prefer Nanairo over Kimagure for many reasons, I sometimes wonder if it would have been better if Nanairo was just a linear visual novel like Kimagure, aka with just Kotori as the only main romanceable, sexable heroine. I will admit Kimagure Temptation is better in that particular aspect. Since it commits so heavily to Annalise as the only heroine, there are no contradictions or weird twists like what they did in Nanairo to force Kotori's importance in all the routes. I want to talk about at least one visual novel not written by Kazuki Fumi for this section, so the final visual novel I'm going to be talking about is Kikokugai the Cyber Slayer, developed by Nitro Plus. In my opinion, it's arguably the most underrated story written by Gen Urobuchi. It's definitely not perfect, but I personally think it works much better as a pseudo one heroine focused visual novel than even Sayana Uta. I've laid out my thoughts on why I don't like Sayana Uta in another video, by the way. What makes Kikokugai such an interesting pseudo one heroine VN is that the premise of the story revolves around the main heroine Ruili. Kikokugai is a pure revenge story about how main character Taoluo Kong has to beat up a bunch of cyborgs who used and abused his sister in one of the most over-the-top, disgusting ways I've seen in a VN. Where the pseudo one heroine focus comes in is that Ruili's personality was separated into multiple, what the story calls gynoids, or robots with some parts of Ruili's original personality called soul fragments. This makes for a really interesting setup, as there are technically multiple girls Taoluo has to find and rescue, but they ultimately are just parts of the main true heroine. Slowly finding out what exactly happened to Ruili through retrieving her soul fragment personalities bit by bit was intriguing, with a final twist so hilarious, it alone made the story worth it for me. This leads to one final comparison I want to do. Most Nitro Plus visual novels tend to have at least 2 major heroines, many of them having the usual 4 to 5. Despite Kikokugai being one of Nitro Plus's earliest VNs, with the original being made in 2002, I think in a way it represents Nitro Plus and Gen Urobuchi's storytelling styles at their most distilled. It has a rarely used cyberpunk setting, just the right amount of edge for memorable poison fiction, cool enough action scenes, and major plot reveals and build-up, all within a story that's slightly less than 10 hours. Bonus points for the quote-unquote all-ages remake that has improved art, full voice acting, and tones down the obnoxious, edgy H-scenes Nitro Plus tends to do without removing their impact on world building and characters. Now that I've talked about the different types of individual one heroine visual novel stories with examples, I want to use this final section to summarize all the pros and cons of one heroine focused stories and analyze how they compare to VNs that focus on multiple heroines. I think that, at their best, when done right, one heroine-focused visual novels can arguably have a stronger focus on storytelling than even multi-heroine ones. A common problem with route-based multi-heroine visual novels is that you have to have a relatively long common route to build up multiple characters. Then you have to make separate stories for each heroine and figure out whether you want tonal consistency or if you want to just focus on generic romance stuff, and on top of that, deciding if you want to base things around an unlockable true route. By having to focus on writing only one main heroine, whether the story genre is romance, character drama, or even something more story heavy, it can be more focused and better paced. In a similar vein, if you're one of those people who does not like to read all the routes in a romance-heavy visual novel, especially ones that don't have any locked true routes or anything, then I think one heroine VNs can work just fine for you, including the VN series that are different routes separated into different purchasable episodes without a common route. Fandiscs that take place after a previously route-based moege can be seen as a reward for the heroines who were the most popular. They show that both the company, who obviously wants to make more money, and the fans, who clearly have a preference towards a specific heroine, can just get more of said heroine without the developers having to waste their time making screen time for a character people don't care as much about. Ideally, it can give the starring heroine more well-done fan service, character development, or just some kind of fitting reward for the heroine so the fans can enjoy it. However, there are some unfortunate downsides to one heroine-focused visual novels, depending on who the reader is, of course. I think that, for the most part, the VN community tend to like longer visual novels, and generally, those are not one heroine-focused. So unfortunately, there will be people who just avoid one heroine-focused VNs altogether because they just want a longer game to get more deeply attached to a world and multiple characters. Speaking of which, I think that many times, because of the visual novel medium's origins, people are used to VNs giving them choices of heroines or love interests. So by depriving people of a choice, whether by making a pseudo one heroine VN that technically has multiple girls but only gives you one romanceable option, or a weird case like an episodic linear series where you technically get multiple heroines but they're separated into different releases you have to read in order, or, in the worst case, a series that could have been a route-based VN with no plot, but the developers just wanted to make more money by charging for each route individually as separate purchases, so the developers ultimately profit at the expense of customers who want to read every route. And finally, while this might seem obvious, if the one heroine-focused visual novel has a heroine that is not particularly interesting or is unlikable, and she's the only option, then you do not have a choice for another heroine. At best, the fan can just choose to not buy the game, and at worst, they're forced into a heroine they may not like and do not have the potential to look forward to another romanceable girl. So while single heroine VNs can be great when done right, they could arguably be worse than a multi-route VN, since at least with multi-route VNs, you can at least grit your teeth through heroines you don't like and hopefully look forward to heroine routes you actually care about. And that concludes my attempted analysis after looking at the potential pros and cons of one heroine-focused visual novels. On a personal level, I tend to prefer route-based VNs, but in recent years, there have been single heroine stories that have become some of my personal favorites, so I've become more open to them. But what are your thoughts on single heroine-focused visual novels? Feel free to leave a comment below.